Silent Hill, the official novel. Written by Sadamu, Yamashita. Translated by Emily, Lady Ducky, Fitch. Chapter 8. There were no doctors at Alchemilla Hospital. No nurses bustling about. No patients sitting in the waiting room, waiting for their name to be called. Not a single soul. Each room Harry checked on the first floor was vacant, abandoned with medical charts and instruments scattered throughout. Every room was perfectly unremarkable, save for one. The hospital director's office was in a state of chaos, as if it had been burglarized. But this was hardly the work of professional thieves. Someone had torn blindly through the office, clearly in search of something. The room was so thoroughly trashed, there was hardly even a place for Harry to set his foot down. If someone was willing to go to such lengths to find something in here, then there might still be a clue that could be of use to him. The floor was littered with books and scattered documents. In one corner, a picture frame lay in a pile of shattered glass. Harry turned it over to examine it. It was a photo of what looked to be an award ceremony, and the man on the stage, smiling and accepting the award, was none other than the man he met earlier. It was Kaufman. If this photo was hanging in the director's office, then it was very possible that Kaufman himself was a hospital director. Harry's suspicions deepened. He should have questioned the man further when he had the chance. Then again, he wasn't too keen on trying the patience of a man with a gun, and he had no guarantee that he'd get the information he wanted. What? Stepping behind the luxurious desk, Harry saw something that gave him pause. At first, he thought it was blood. A bottle lay shattered on the floor, its dark red contents spilled into a puddle on the floor. Collecting a small amount of the liquid on his fingertips, Harry found that it was completely odorless and a bit too thin to be blood. Perhaps it was medicine? It was a hospital, after all. But Harry wasn't entirely convinced. Hospital or not, it was strange to find a bottle of medicine just sitting around in someone's office like this. Maybe it was a sample of something left here by a pharmaceutical representative. The words he read on the police station blackboard came to mind. White Claudia. Could this liquid be the drug PTV? Ridiculous as it might have been, he couldn't shake the suspicion from his mind. Harry left the director's office and headed for the examination room. Scanning over the shelves, he picked up an unused syringe and a pill bottle before returning. He sucked up as much liquid as he could into the syringe, dumping the pills on the floor so he could fill the empty bottle. With a bit of effort, he was able to fill half the bottle. The woman at the church told him he'd find the answers he needed here, and if Cheryl had been caught up in the schemes of illegal drug traffickers, this red liquid should be enough evidence to prove it. And even if Cheryl's disappearance had nothing to do with drugs, this might motivate law enforcement to take his case more seriously. With the Silent Hill police out of commission, he might even have to bring this all the way to the FBI. I knew it. That man is definitely up to something suspicious. Harry thought to himself as he continued his search, his footsteps echoing through the abandoned hospital. This so-called Dr. Kaufman. If he would hide his identity as the hospital director, then what else could he be hiding? Such a prestigious position would certainly allow him to distribute PTV without arousing suspicion. He had all the equipment and materials at his disposal. He could even easily disguise it as regular medical activity. Then there was the strange woman he met in the church. After hearing her speak delusional nonsense and seeing the fanatical spark in her eyes, he could easily believe she was on drugs. But as crazy as her words had been, they did end up leading him to the truth. Harry planned on inspecting the basement next, but the staircase landing was blocked off by the fire doors. He went to his last option, the elevator, pressing the call button while praying it still worked. The doors opened in an instant. However, the real problem was inside. No matter how many times he pushed the buttons for the second and third floors, nothing happened. The only button that responded was the one marked for the fourth floor. Fourth floor? Harry questioned as the elevator began its ascent. He'd seen Alchemilla Hospital from the outside, and it seemed only to have 3 floors. So how was the elevator supposed to take him to a non-existent 4th floor? None of the other buttons were lit up. Could something be trying to guide me? Though the thought sent a chill down his spine, Harry knew there was no going back now. The elevator doors slid open. Harry knew that in some Asian countries, the number 4 meant death. That description fit the atmosphere of the 4th floor perfectly. Unlike the relatively normal-looking first floor, this floor looked like it was falling apart. Grimy linoleum, peeling plaster, rusted doors, black soot falling from the ceiling, this place seemed that it had been abandoned for years and left to rot. Light trickled through the dusty, yellowed windows, bathing the hallway in an eerie glow. Taking the stairs down to the third floor presented Harry with the same suffocating environment. No light could reach down here. There was only dense darkness. The state of decay seemed even worse. Parts of the building's foundation were exposed, and the path before him was nothing but a chain-link mesh spread across where the floor should have been. In some places, the mesh was missing altogether, leaving nothing but gaping dark holes in the floor. Even with the aid of his flashlight, Harry couldn't see the bottom. It felt like he'd wandered into some deep underground cave. It certainly wouldn't be unusual for deformed monstrosities to be lurking in a place like this. His ominous prediction would come true sooner than he expected. Harry knew the nurse approaching from the darkness wasn't human. His radio told him so. The crackling noise swelled with each step she took. Soon, her monstrous form was illuminated. The nurse's gait was unsteady, and she was hunched over like an old woman, even though her face still looked young. She seemed to be carrying something on her back, and something told Harry that she wasn't just giving a young patient a piggyback ride. Something akin to a camel's hump protruded from her back, like something large had attached itself to her. As she stumbled closer, Harry caught the glint of a scalpel she held in a clenched fist. The smile she aimed at him was dripping with dark intent. She was eager to dissect her new prey. She wanted to tear off his skin, chop him to pieces, rip out his organs, nourish her young, soft skin with his fresh blood. "Please," Harry called to the nurse in a somber voice, his gun clenched in his hands. "I don't want to shoot you. You're just being controlled by a monster. If there's any part of you in there that can still hear me, then please listen. Just step out of my way. Please, if you just step aside, I won't have to hurt you." The nurse's feet moved faster. She'd broken out into a clumsy sprint and was lunging at him. Harry's fingertip hesitated at the trigger. Maybe if he could manage to shoot the parasite-like hump on her back, he could subdue the monster without killing the nurse. But he was worried he wouldn't have the skill to pull it off. He had no military experience, and had only recently shot a gun for the first time. Even his results at the shooting range were terrible. Plus, the nurse was moving so erratically that by aiming for the hump, he'd be just as likely to hit her head as well. Even with a crazed, knife-wielding nurse rushing straight at him, Harry couldn't bring himself to shoot. He leapt to the side at the last possible second, narrowly avoiding the scalpel but slamming shoulder first into the opposite wall. The nurse stumbled past, carried by the momentum of the extra weight on her back, but she quickly recovered, turning to come at Harry again. Harry crouched to the floor and finally aimed the gun, wincing at the pain in his right shoulder. A thought occurred to him. What if this nurse wasn't actually human at all? What if it was a monster pretending to be a possessed human, just to prey on his sympathy? If there were creatures loose in this town that could control people, wouldn't he have seen possessed patients too? What about the rest of the townspeople, or tourists, or even the police? But he hadn't seen one. That had to be it. He was being deceived. The nurse's face was a foot away. He opened fire. The barrage of bullets flew between her eyes and pierced her skull. The nurse's body twitched as blood and brain fluid poured from her collapsed face, before going limp and collapsing onto the floor. All that remained was the crooked smile on her lips. A persistent haze clouded Harry's thoughts. Despite the justifications he'd made himself believe, killing the nurse had left a bad taste in his mouth. It was just another monster, another obstacle in his way. He had every reason to eliminate it. Still, the image of the nearly human woman, bleeding out on the floor, plagued him with unwarranted guilt. Was it really the monster he made it out to be? Had he actually murdered someone he could have saved? Had he made the right decision? Those questions replayed in his mind over and over until even his devotion to finding Cheryl couldn't justify his actions. He wandered like a sleepwalker through the hospital's winding corridors. Before he knew it, Harry ended up down in the basement. He pushed open the first door he saw, stepping into the cluttered storeroom. The boxes stacked on the ground and the medical supplies lining the rusty shelves were caked in what seemed to be several years' worth of dust. Perhaps because of his lightheaded days, Harry's eyes were drawn right to a point of suspicion. A shelf in the very back of the storeroom. The room was packed with so many boxes that there was hardly any room to walk, but the area around that particular shelf was bare. Making his way closer to investigate, he saw marks trailing along the ground, as if something had been dragged across. Despite the aged state of the room, it looked as if the shelf had been moved frequently, and recently too. Harry pushed it to the side, and revealed a hidden door. It opened into a gaping passage deeper into the basement. Harry should have been elated. What better place for Cheryl to be hidden than a secret passage? But all he could do was stand and stare into the darkness. The encounter with the nurse had shaken him. He felt gripped by the same fear as when he'd faced a giant creature in the school basement. Harry slumped to the floor, leaning against the wall and closing his eyes. It must be around noon by now. He hadn't really slept, or even stopped to rest in well over 24 hours. The wariness in his mind and the fatigue in his body weighed on him until he finally escaped into the respite of sleep. "Daddy?" Cheryl sat on Harry's lap as he rested in an armchair. She nestled closer. "Are you sleeping?" He had been sitting here with his head in his hands for a long time, then suddenly closed his eyes. The 3-year-old looked up at her father, her face full of worry. Harry had lost himself in grief after Jodi's passing. Memories of her occupied his every thought, even the wonderful memories of her gentle smile. Something that should have given him comfort only tormented him further. "Hey, Dad?" Cheryl shook her father's knee in alarm. "Daddy, please be okay. I don't want you to go away too. Please don't leave me alone." Her pleas reached straight to the bottom of his broken heart. Harry slowly opened his eyes. Cheryl. At only 3 years old, she'd been forced to know the sorrows of death. Now she feared that it would take her father, the only person she had left in the world. The shock hit him as if Jodi had slapped him in the face. "You're her father. You have to be here for her now." He lifted his daughter up and held her tight in his arms. "I'm so sorry, Cheryl. Daddy's been really careless lately. I was so caught up in the past that I forgot that the most important thing in the world was right in front of me." Cheryl was his treasure, the greatest gift he'd ever been given in life. She deserved every ounce of devotion in his heart. With that loving embrace, he swore that the two of them would live happy lives together, no matter what. Harry awoke to the sight of teardrops on the dust-covered floor before him. For that one moment, he was able to hold Cheryl in his arms again. Though sorrow still sat heavy in his chest, seeing her smiling face in his dream was enough to fill him with renewed determination. Harry felt as if he'd gotten a full night's sleep, despite his watch saying that only 30 minutes had passed. He was damn lucky none of the monsters wandered down here. Harry pulled himself to his feet to confront the dark passage. Jodi must have been watching over him. In that moment, he felt all the doubt and fear melt away. He would keep that promise he made to Cheryl all those years ago. No matter the cost, he'd bring her home safe. Behind the hidden door was a smaller, narrow storage room, lined with bare shelves. The only feature in the room was a storage hatch on the floor that lifted with a rusty creak to reveal a stairway leading deeper underground. The room at the bottom of those stairs was identical to the one upstairs, enough to give Harry an odd sense of déjà vu, but it was far from the feeling of familiar comfort. The darkness had solidified into a thick wall that bore down on him from all sides, banished only by the paltry light of his flashlight. An appalling chill snaked its way up Harry's spine. It was the same heavy, otherworldly darkness that he felt in the other school, the twisted version of reality that lay beyond the clock tower. A dull hiss sounded from the radio in his pocket, steadily growing louder. Pounding footsteps rapidly approached from the darkness until a sprinting nurse came into view. She was different from the one Harry had faced before. She wore visible signs of age on her face, and her dark hair was flecked with gray. But she had the same hunched posture, the same throbbing hump on her back, and the same murderous grin stretched across her wrinkled face. The only other difference was a thick syringe she clutched in her hand and raised above her head, ready to strike. There was no way of knowing what kind of vile liquid was sloshing around inside that syringe, but Harry wasn't about to find out. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Do it for Cheryl. He steeled himself and unloaded 2 bullets into the woman's stomach. She recoiled with a shriek, clutching her gushing wound as she collapsed into a bloody pile on the floor. But it was far from over. A newcomer was alerted by the commotion and let out a savage roar as it stumbled over the nurse's body and lunged at Harry. He dodged just in time as a pair of scissors sliced past his head, firing another round at the new monster in the process. The bullet just barely grazed the shoulder of what was once a well-dressed young doctor, now a rabid monster, just like the nurses. He wasted no time grabbing Harry's arm, forcing them into a close combat struggle. Before Harry could turn the muzzle to the doctor again, he felt the cold steel scissors pierce his wrist, loosening his grip and sending the gun to the floor. Harry fought for his life through the biting pain, beating the doctor back with his bare hands as he tried to anticipate where those scissors would strike next. In a moment of pure desperation, he grabbed the doctor by the chest and headbutted the monster in his head with all his might. The doctor stumbled backwards with a heavy groan. Harry took advantage of his stunned opponent and smacked the scissors from his hand with his flashlight. Now, if only for a moment, the two were finally on equal footing. Adrenaline coursing through him, Harry let out a yell and hurled his body at the doctor, tackling him to the ground. As the two fell into a heap of flailing limbs, Harry's flashlight slipped from his hand and rolled against the far wall. Suddenly bathed in disorienting darkness, Harry felt a pair of hands grab him by the neck. The doctor dug his fingers into his throat, squeezing with almost supernatural strength. Gasping and choking, Harry struggled to push his attacker away with his right hand, while groping through the darkness for his gun with the left. Come on. Come on. He should have dropped it around here. It had to be there. Or else... His heart leapt as his hand closed around something cold and metallic. It was too thin to be a gun, but a pair of scissors would save his life all the same. Clenching it tight, he stabbed the doctor. A wet, gurgling scream pierced the darkness, and the doctor's grip went limp. Finally taking in a lungful of precious air, Harry shoved the monster away and scrambled for his flashlight to view the aftermath. The doctor was writhing in agony on the floor, the pair of scissors buried deep in his neck. Harry's gun lay on the ground, not too far away. He picked it up, looking down upon the pathetic creature. One shot was all it took to put it out of its misery. A monster is a monster, after all. He would have just as easily killed him. The sooner Harry could shake his unnecessary sentimentality, the longer he'd survive in a place like this. Harry continued on with a heavy gait. He had 4 rounds left, but the harrowing encounter with the doctor had left him shaking and exhausted. If another nurse appeared, he didn't feel too confident in his chances. Nonetheless, he set about the task of checking each room in the long corridor. With every empty room, he felt both a wave of relief and disappointment. He wouldn't have to fight for his life again, but he wasn't any closer to finding his daughter either. What's this? The final room Harry entered was identical to the others, but somehow the atmosphere felt different. It was a simple hospital room, with nothing but a neatly made bed and a nightstand. But somehow it had avoided the corrupting force that had left the rest of the ward in ruin. It was as pristine as a new hotel room, and looked to have been cleaned quite recently. Was someone being treated here? And where were they now? Harry's chest tightened. Cheryl could have been here. His daughter could have stood in this very room before being whisked off again to God knows where. Harry's eyes were drawn to a picture frame sitting atop the nightstand. He saw, to his surprise, the face of a young girl. Her eyes seemed distant, and her expression was tinged with melancholy. Harry recognized her instantly as a mysterious girl he'd spotted in the boiler room back at the elementary school. As he stared into those sorrowful eyes, Harry became certain of one thing. This girl was the one held prisoner in this room, not Cheryl. But just who was she? Even after all he'd been through, Harry had been unable to find a single trace of Cheryl in this hospital. The only remaining lead he had was a suspicious Dr. Kaufman, but he was long gone. He could be halfway out of the state by now. Harry still had his one meager connection to the Brahms police force. He wondered if he could get them to open an investigation to track the man down. Weighed down with disappointment, Harry trekked back to the first floor. He found the previously locked fire escape and unlocked it from the inside, pushing it open to reveal a grim sight. The once bright and spotless hospital he saw when he first arrived had decayed to the same state as the basement. The walls, the floor, even the air itself had been corroded by darkness. It was as if the building had aged centuries in the short time he'd been away. Looking around in morbid bewilderment, Harry made his way back to the waiting room. A theater stage set in perfect facade of normalcy on one side, but simply walk behind it and one can see it from a different perspective. Did Silent Hill have two faces as well? If his theory was correct, then whatever was happening at the school and the hospital must be connected. Harry was walking past an examination room door when a sudden noise gave him pause. Someone was in there. Another nurse? The wise option would be to just keep walking, but he couldn't ignore the slim possibility that it might be Cheryl. Who knows, maybe Kaufman forgot something important and risked a return trip for it. Harry took a deep breath and clenched his gun, feeling a dull throb of pain in the hand the monstrous doctor had stabbed. His joints ached, his body was plagued by fatigue, and he could feel his resolve crumbling by the second. But when it came down to it, he had no choice. If things went bad again, he'd just turn around and run for it. Please let me make it out alive. Harry murmured a quiet prayer as he swung the door open. Hands shaking, he pointed the flashlight and muzzle at every corner of the room. Just as he suspected, a nurse was crouched under a desk, lying in wait. She looked up at him, squinting in the flashlight's glare. Harry was poised to pull the trigger, but the look on her face stopped him. He wasn't met with a distorted smile, nor did she have a stumbling gait or a grotesque hump. "Thank God, another normal person," the nurse exclaimed as she scrambled out from under the desk. Harry finally lowered the gun. Her face was filled with relief. She hardly even noticed she'd nearly been shot. "I'm Lisa Garland, but you can call me Lisa." "Name's Harry Mason." "Harry is fine." Her bright smile and warm demeanor seemed to ease his tired mind and heal his weary body in an instant. She must have an incredible bedside manner. Harry might have actually enjoyed being a patient here if she were the one taking care of him. "It feels like I've been lost in here forever. I was hoping someone would come to save me soon." "I'm looking for someone too. I came here looking for answers, but those nurses... Everyone's lost their minds. You and I are the only normal people left." "It's so awful. I blacked out here, and when I came to, the staff, the patients, everyone was just gone. Harry, what on earth is happening here?" "I wish I knew. I'm just a tourist. By the time I arrived, everyone was already gone." "It's like a living nightmare. I just wish I could wake up." Lisa's cheerful smile faded. Harry couldn't help but sympathize with her, holed up here all alone as the world seemed to crumble around her. "Anyway, we should hurry up and get out of here. I'll stay with you." "Of course, but there's something I have to do before I can leave. I'm looking for my daughter." "Your daughter's missing?" "Yeah. Her name's Cheryl. Short, black hair, just turned 7. Do you know anything?" "I was unconscious for a while, so I haven't seen anyone." "Sorry." "That's all right. No need to apologize." He was feeling let down by her answer, but one nagging question still remained. It surely had nothing to do with Cheryl, but it had been weighing on his mind for a while now. "I found this weird hidden room in the basement, and there was a picture of a young girl in there. Do you know anything about her?" "Hidden room? What are you talking about?" "Yeah, I found this staircase inside one of the storage rooms, and..." His words were cut short by a jarring screech of a siren. "Damn my head." Harry clutched his head as the shrill call seemed to echo inside his skull. "Harry, what's wrong?" Lisa looked to him, concerned. The sound was so loud it seemed to be drowning out his own thoughts, How could she not hear it? Was it all in his head? Harry? Stay with me? Harry? Harry? Harry. Lisa's voice drifted further and further away before it disappeared into the reverberating sirens. The pain throbbing in his head turned his vision dark. In an instant, the sound stopped. When Harry forced his eyes back open, there was no sign of Lisa. The examination room was just as bright and clean as when he first visited. It appears you're able to escape the grasp of the darkness. A voice that didn't belong to Lisa pulled Harry from his confusion. He looked up to see the aged face of the woman from the church. You. I believe introductions are overdue. You may call me Dahlia Gillespie. I don't care about your name. I want to know where my daughter is. I only came to this godforsaken hospital because of you, and there's nothing here. I'm afraid you were too late. What are you talking about? The darkness. Dahlia's voice was calm, but her eyes glistened with intense fervor. This town is being devoured by darkness. Strength must overcome petty desire. Childish sleep talk. I knew this day would come. Harry stared in disbelief as utter nonsense poured from her mouth. Just as he suspected, this lady was completely crazy after all. Just because of all the bizarre things happening in town, he'd let this delusional old woman send him on a wild goose chase that nearly got him killed. He was shaken from his thoughts when Dahlia addressed him again. Have you not seen the crest marked on the ground, all over town? A crest, like the one in the schoolyard. It is the mark of Samael, etched across all corners of this town. You mustn't let it be completed. Samael, a being also called the Red Serpent, revered as some as an angel, reviled by others as a demon. Only you can end this. It is beyond my abilities. If you are able to halt the mark's completion, the darkness plaguing this town will be dispelled, and you may even be reunited with your little girl. There's another church in this town. That is your destination. Don't let it be completed. Dahlia placed something atop the desk as she spoke. A key. Harry's gaze wandered for but a moment, distracted by the metal gleam. When he looked back, Dahlia had vanished. Harry tilted his head. As he sat in the heavy stillness, only one thought occupied his mind. That woman is a witch.